Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I wanted to say it was early, but I guess 10 is pretty okay for a debating competition. So I'm going to talk about whip speeches today. And I think one of the main issues with whip speeches is that for a large part, it depends. So it depends a lot on the debate, on what you want to do. And I think that can sometimes make it extremely difficult as a speech, specifically if you're not experienced, but it also makes it difficult for me to give a kind of one-size-fits-all training or explanation of what a whip speech should do. So if there's any questions or specific situations that you want to know something about, please feel free to just ask and bring it up. And just as we go, think, oh, this is something I want to know, what I've always wondered about whip speeches, and I'll try to fit it in. And as Matt said, at the end, there'll of course be a moment where everyone can ask questions. I'm okay with people unmuting themselves if they want to ask questions. I'm not sure if you're able to do so, but feel free to. And otherwise, I'll have the chat open. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, so I think the first thing that you have to discuss, and what we often do when we explain debate to novices or just in general, is what should a whip speaker do? And I think we often oversimplify a little bit, because the story that we tell is, well, you have to provide a very biased summary of the debate, and that means that people get the idea that what you should be doing is ignoring the strong arguments of the other side and pretending lots was proven on your side, even though that's not necessarily true. And I think that creates this kind of weird difference between what good whip speakers and not as good whip speakers do. So I think that what you actually should do as a whip speaker is that you have to give a summary which is biased, in the meaning that it is a summary with the goal of making your team win, not necessarily an overview of the debate which shows you've already won. So I think that rather than having a summary which simply ignores the good sides and talks about, or ignores the good sides of the other side and mostly focuses on what you did really well, I think it's a summary which should literally go into the paper of the judge and help them decide on whether you win and give them the reasoning as to why you win. So it should be biased, but it shouldn't just be a bad summary. It should be an overview, which then helps you win. I think whip speakers mostly have to be versatile, because I think what you have to judge a good whip speaker by is not necessarily what they do in their speech, but what's done at the end of the debate and their team. So I think that there's three things you always have to do when you're in second half. So you have to prove what's new in your case and what you're actually adding to the debate. Then you have to explain why that matters in the debate, why it's important at all, why it's not just a random, nice philosophical argument which no one has talked about, but why it actually is something that people should be talking about. And three, I think why you have to explain why you did that best and why your argument is the best. Given the fact that you're the second speaker, I think often whip speakers have to be versatile. And if your first speaker, your extension speaker, is extremely good at constructive, you probably have to do more deconstructive work. You have to do more impact. If your first speaker is super strategic and does a lot of rebuttal, you have to do more building and you have to do more construction. So I think that the main thing that a whip speaker has to do is be an addition to the extension speech. And even though we'd all like to think that you're important in and of itself, I think a whip speech should be supportive and should make the extension speech win. And it shouldn't be the focus that that whip speech in and of itself is so genius that it wins. Which might mean you have to put your ego aside, but it does mean that you have to focus on what your team is bringing, not necessarily what you think the smartest rebuttal is, or something like that. So I think that when it comes to the relationship between whip speeches and extension speeches, very often we see that whip speeches and speakers are more likely to be very disruptive and more strategic, whereas extension speakers are very likely to be more constructive. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be based on that team dynamic where your extension speaker has done a lot of logic and has done the majority of mechanisms, and you simply can pick and choose and be super lazy with your mechanisms because you have a first speaker that has already done that. So I think in an ideal world, the whip speech focuses on winning from the opposite bench. So if you're in closing government, a whip speech is responsible for making sure you beat opening opposition and closing opposition, and the extension speech is responsible for winning from opening government. And if you're in CO, the opposite, right? So your extension speech has to make sure you go over your first half, and then whip speeches have to make sure that you beat the opposite bench. Obviously, everything's a team, right? So if your extension speech is amazing, you might have already won the debate. If your extension speech doesn't trade off against first half, that's still the responsibility of the whip speech. But I think very often that's kind of the way the responsibilities play out. So a lot of that will be what I'm assuming a whip speaker should do. However, as I said, whip speeches, you can only be a good whip speaker if you're good at both constructive and deconstructive, because you just have to adapt based on what happened previously in the debate. And I think speakers have to become more versatile as the debate continues. So how do you structure a whip speech? I think the way you structure a whip speech, there's basically 3 different ways to structure a whip speech and think about a whip speech. So I think 1, you can do it in debate clashes and the big questions. I think 2, you can do it in trade-offs. So basically, or the second part of that structure is explaining which clashes are most important. And I think 3, which is kind of like a newer thing, or at least in my opinion, but maybe for you it's already kind of old, but comparatives between teams. So I think you increasingly see people who structure their whip speech by saying, I'm firstly going to talk about opening government, then opening opposition, then CO, and then they don't really give content, but they make very specific trade-offs with teams. I'm not sure that's always the best thing, but I think those are the 3 things. So I think that what you then do is you have to decide based on your time management, and you have to decide based on who you think is winning the round so far. And the main thing you have to do is, 1, if you beat the team that has won so far, like necessarily you become first. So I think that's the easiest way to decide which one of those 3 things you want to do. But I think very often you get the you get the like a mix and a hybrid. So both you make clashes within the debate, you have to do lots of trade-offs between those clashes, and then within some of those clashes you have to trade off between teams. But I think these 3 parts of a whip speech usually have to be part of your structure, and how you structure those depends on what you think happened previously in the debate. So how do you decide on clashes, and what are those clashes? I actually think that very often clashes are are different alternatives to the same 3 questions. And obviously there's always these 3 debates that people can mention where that's not the case, but I think very often all of the clashes are very concrete forms of 3 specific questions. Yeah, so how do you decide? Okay, sorry, a question is, someone's asking a question like, how do you know which team is going to come first or second or third? I'll come back to that after I've explained what clashes, how you can find clashes. So I think once you become more experienced, it is easier to just simply look at the debate and kind of see how it goes and be like, I think this is a clash, that's a clash. But if that's more difficult for you, and you're someone who very often makes a clash and judges are like, well, I didn't really see where that clash was coming from, I think there's usually 3 things you can think of in prep time that already predict what the clashes are going to be. So I think 1, very often, does it work or not? So if the debate is this house would ban drugs, people are going to talk about whether there's going to be more or less drug use, whether there's going to be more or less violence as a result from drug use or as a result from drug trafficking, right? So I think that does it work is very often already one part. Like in high school, you get the idea of you have to identify a problem and identify a solution, and that's what debate's about. I think very often the first clash does boil down to, look, are we going to solve the problem? I think the second thing is, then is there collateral damage? So are there groups that are not part of the problem that we're trying to solve that are going to be harmed by it? And I think that in the debate about drug use might be, look, we are trying to solve it for kids who we don't want to start using drugs. That is the first clash, but then a second clash becomes, look, what's going to happen to people who are already addicted? What's going to happen to people who are going to be affected when a black market arises and there's going to be violence or criminality as a result from that? So I think, is there collateral damage? What is that collateral damage? And I think the third clash then is it worth it? Because I don't want to say that there's only practical arguments that are important, but is it worth it very often boils down to weighing off the collateral versus the solution, right? Like what's more important, a few less people using drugs, or those people who are going to be very badly affected by banning it and are going to have issues there. But it might also be, look, there are certain rights we cannot infringe upon. There are certain principled reasons as to why we shouldn't do this. So even if it works, there's this principle, which means it isn't worth it. And those three questions, I think, very often are very abstract forms of what the clashes in the debate are going to be. So I think that if you already know your case, know the arguments that you think opposition are going to make, you can kind of predict what the clashes are going to be. And I think if you have a rough idea of what those clashes are, it becomes easier to kind of fit everything in. And of course, you always have that one debate where everything changes and you're like, oh, my clashes are wrong. But I think in general, it kind of helps you to identify the clashes in 90% of the cases. Okay, so the question, how do you know which team is going to be first or second or third? I think one, that's a reason why I think whip speeches have to judge debates, and you have to go to competition to judge debates with good judges, because you need to get a feel for what type of like how you make calls between different teams. I think two, there's different ways of how you can judge that. Like, I think that in general, if the majority of the team are responding to, of the other teams are responding to one particular team, so you're in a room and opening government gives good speeches, you're impressed by it, and opening opposition keeps rebutting it, and closing government spends the majority of their time talking about opening government and how they trade off. So everyone's talking about opening government. Very often opening government probably did really well, and you want to beat opening government in order to beat the rest. So I think that's one way of identifying it if you can't really judge it yourself. I think the second might be just like gut feeling. Very often you have this feeling in the debate where you think, wow, that was an amazing speech. And even if you can't really put it into words yet, I think that your gut feeling can be a good way to judge it whilst in the debate. I think the risk is always, because I know if I'm a whip speaker, I always think my side is doing better than they are. So very often the team I identify as the best team in the round is the team that is my first half. So like OG when you're CG, because you're getting in the mindset of the debate, right? You're like, this side is the good side, that side is the bad side. So you have to be a little bit careful, but I think that the best way is also just to try and make the call, because very often if people are unsure, they're afraid to make the decision, which means they make no decision, which means you can never get any feedback on how you called the debate or how you saw the debate. So I think the best way is to kind of trial and error and try different things. And as I said, judge and try to kind of get an intuition. Also, when I just started speaking, I would very often at the end of the debate always write down my predicted call. So even if it wasn't about, I think I took a first, but just like, what did other teams do? How would I trade those teams off? And in that way, you can still kind of practice the way you make trade-offs between teams, even when you're in the debate and you're, I guess, a little bit biased. And you can see where other judges place them and stuff like that. So I think that's the easiest way. But yeah, judging. And I think that this is one of the difficult things of whip speeches, right? Sometimes you identify the wrong team and then you just focus wrong. But I think you have to make the decision, because making no decision means you basically still make the wrong decision, right? So I think that you have to at least make a call and then just roll with it. And the worst thing that can happen is that you take a third. But if you do this well, you'll at least take a third, right? There's at least one team that you decide on. Okay, so within the clashes, once you've identified those clashes, I think you have to, basically how you win the clash is just who has the best mechanism, which mechanism makes the most difference, what's the logic that does most harm or most good to the mechanism. And this is where you use the majority of your extension speech. Hopefully, your extension speech has brought so many different arguments and logic that you can simply just kind of pick and choose. If I'm writing my whip speeches, within my mechanisms, I'll have my clashes identified. I'll have like the stuff that I think I need to respond to from other teams. And then my extension speaker starts speaking and I just copy whatever they say, right? I just kind of steal their mechanisms and maybe I'll reframe them, or I'll link them to a different part of the debate, or I'll make sure that I kind of make the link between our argument and why that also rebuts another argument. But I think that the easiest way to win within clashes and to kind of do harm there is when you can use the extension and the stuff that your extension speaker has already said. So I think the second thing that you have to do within your whip speech is make decisions between clashes and which clashes are most important. And I think that one of the things you learn when you've debated as long as I have is that very often there is a clear clash that proposition is going to win, and there is a clear clash that opposition is going to win. So in the This House Would Ban Drugs, if people are going to kind of go on for a really long time, I think that you can say that fewer people are going to use drugs if you ban it because it's going to be more difficult to get. And I think you can say for those who do still get it, the drugs are going to be of a lower quality and the drugs are going to be more dangerous because rather than buying it in a specific shop, you have to go to a drug dealer who's a criminal, stuff like that. So I think that regardless of what's going to happen in the debate, it's very likely, extremely likely, that proposition is going to win one clash and opposition is going to win one clash. And I think the risk you have in those debates is that you get carried away by trying to win the unwinnable. Whereas I think the best thing is to, within the clash, try as much as you can, but then between clashes, make sure that the clash that you are winning is going to be seen as the most important and is going to be weighed the most. And I think that especially if you're a whip speaker and kind of the debates become more difficult, at some point you're like, look, I can make arguments about anything, I can analyze everything, there's so much analysis that I can come up with, and I have 15 different mechanisms for this one particular argument. But it kind of means that you're very likely to just fight very difficult fights rather than just focus on what you're probably already winning and then explaining why it's important. And I think that second step is something that people very often forget, and it's the easiest way to win a debate because, as I said, very often you already are going to win a particular clash simply because of the way the motion works. And the way CAs come up with motions, you kind of have this one argument on proposition, which is probably true, this one argument on opposition, which is probably true, and then the debate really becomes about what's more important. And I think there's different ways of making trade-offs between clashes, but I think there's three ways which always make it the easiest. I think one, how many people are affected, kind of just counting the number of people. I think two, how badly are those people affected? Probably using drugs once is not that detrimental to your health. Maybe a very Dutch idea, but I think having super unhealthy drugs, even though there's fewer people who use the super unhealthy drugs, perhaps it's so bad if you use those drugs where there's no kind of control or no health regulation. And even though there's fewer people, the harm is so much worse that they still are, that clash still becomes more important. Or the other way around, I think you can say, look, there's so many more people that even if the few people that are still going to use drugs are badly affected, like that's just a small minority. And I think you have to trade those off. And I think then within that, you still have to, of course, give the mechanisms, right? So that's where your clashes become important, and the kind of mechanistic work that your extension speaker hopefully did becomes important, but you have to make that trade-off. And I think the third thing, which is kind of like an easy way out if you don't really know how to do the math of how bad is it versus how many people are it and how does that kind of work together. I think how much do we care about those people? And this is something that feels bad if you say it like that, like deciding on who's important and who isn't important. But I think we do it all the time, right? So if you say, look, this is about children, we usually care a lot more about it than when it's about other people. If it's about people who are vulnerable, who cannot protect themselves, there might be a different responsibility to protect those people rather than people who can simply do it themselves. People who are forced into something might have a different, like we might have different responsibilities towards them. So we might care more about them if we have to protect them. So I think that those three kind of all interact, and sometimes that can get really difficult. And I think that you always have to kind of keep the overview. So you don't want to just have proposition says, we have so many people are going to be better. And then opposition says, yes, but the minority is going to be harmed so much. So you have to still make arguments or kind of explain why one part is more important than the other. But I think the easiest way to win any debate is to be like, look, there's this one very small part, which is basically always true. And that's the part that I'm going to explain is the most important. And I think that just means it's a lot easier and better. So those two ways, so both within clashes saying, look, we've explained this mechanism, which is really important. This is why we therefore win the clash. Or two, look, we've brought this new clash, but this is the most important clash for other reasons. I think very often boil down to, look, we said the smartest things, the smartest team should win. Therefore, we take a first. I think it basically means you have to do, you don't have to necessarily judge the debate correctly, and you don't necessarily have to think like a judge. As I said, of course, you still want to focus and have strategic time management, but I think you basically just have to bring the best arguments. I think if you do the third type of comparison and part of your speech, which is the between teams, which can be like an entire structure in and of itself, I think you should only do that if you're confident that you can judge a debate. And you're of course still going to make mistakes and there's still going to be issues, but I think in general, you should only do that when you can actually judge a debate. And I think the second thing that you have to be aware of is that there's a huge risk of repetitiveness, because very often it's not like there's a million arguments in a debate, right? People are still going to talk about the same topics. People are still going to talk about the same themes. So even if people make slightly different arguments or slightly, like very often, both opening government and closing government are going to have the same type of focus, or at least the same groups they're talking about. So I think there's always a huge risk, especially on a bench, that you're just going to repeat yourself so often. And I think that's why when people do use this strategy of saying, I'm firstly going to talk about OG, OO, then CG or CO, very often you'll hear like, yeah, I've already responded to that when I talked about opening government. And I just don't necessarily think it's a very strategic decision time-wise. So whilst I think it works sometimes, I think you have to be very careful with that. If you make that call, if you make the call so clearly about how you think the debate's going to go, if you don't make the right judging call, that's going to backfire. And I think too, there's a risk of repetitiveness. However, having said all of that, I think it is particularly powerful when you want to frame out the entire opening half. So basically just say, look, this is the way opening half should be judged. This is what the judges are currently feeling. They think opening didn't explain this well enough, but that was a very fair attack. This was missing. This is why these teams are basically equal, and it's very difficult to make that decision. They are both not doing that well. And then this is what we add to the debate. So judges, at the end of the first half, I know you were thinking, this is something that still needs to be explained. This is something that still needs to be explained. That's what we did. Therefore, we at least take it over first half, right? So I think that it can be very powerful, but you have to make sure that you actually judge the debate correctly. Another question. So when you're deciding who's more important, the other side can always say that the other group is more important. So basically, doesn't it become kind of like intuition trading? How do you prove that your group is the most important? So I think that very often you then go into more principled analysis. So as I said, I think that there are different reasons as to why we care about particular groups. I think one is that you say, look, we're the one actor that can protect these people. And I think that's one of the reasons that we often, intervene in a free market when we say, look, if we don't do anything, no one's going to stick up for people who don't have money, whereas the people who do have money might be harmed, but they are people who can still kind of adapt to that harm, or they are people who they'll still have enough money to pay for nice things, but now we redistribute a little bit, which means that those who didn't have an option beforehand now do have an option. So basically you compare the resilience of the groups that you're talking about. And I think that there's different specific principled reasons as to why we might care. I think part of principle analysis in the end does come down to intuition, which it also does when it comes to like other mechanistic reasons, right? There needs to be a base assumption of what we all find important from which you begin arguing. I think how much do we care about those people very often boils down to how many other options do these people have? And just in general, like, I think, what are the characteristics of this group as a reason why we might care? So children are going to live a lot longer than people who are not children. Children might be affected differently. So I think that it still depends on argumentation, but how much do we care very often then just boils down to either principled analysis on who deserves or who we should give who we should take responsibility for, or analysis around the effect and characteristics of those specific people. So I think that I cannot give you one way to always explain why your group is the most important in the debate. And I think there's multiple reasons, but very often it does boil down to who has alternatives, who has specific characteristics, which means they are hit in a different way. Or thirdly, intuition. And people always pretend they're too good for that. But I do think that kind of a lot of your principled intuitions are things that exist within a system, right? I think that we all have, like most legal systems have protections for particular groups because there's specific intuitions. And then if the debate becomes about something very particular, you can say, look, there's all of these other places where we take the same responsibility, where we behave in the same way, where we protect this group in the same way, which means there's kind of like, you can make the intuition more logical or more intuitive. Okay, so yeah, so I think that now there's two very similar questions. So the ratio of a comparative versus a rebuttal in the whip, and dividing your time for speeches. So as I said, I cannot tell you how to do this specifically because it depends. It depends what your goal in the debate is. It depends what happened before your speech, and it depends on what you think is necessary and who you're defeating. I think dividing your time for speeches, what I always like to do, but I know my team partner always thought it was horrible at the last Euros. So it just really depends on personal preference. But my time division usually is kind of getting all the unimportant stuff that needs to happen out of the way, and then focusing on what's winning the debate for the last 4 minutes or so. So whether that is doing a little rebuttal to the CG, which you didn't think that was that good, whether you think that is doing the comparative with first half, which isn't that good, but you just want to make sure it's on the paper of the judges, kind of going through that very quickly. And then what you think is the reason you win the debate, whether that is the comparative, the rebuttal, or like a very good constructive argument, putting that in the last 4 minutes. And that should be the majority of your speech. I think secondly, comparative versus rebuttal is partly a personal preference. I would say mostly comparatives and rebuttal where needed. So I think that if you do rebuttal, it should be needed in order for you to win the debate. I know that it feels really nice to do rebuttal and kind of be like, that argument was really dumb for all of these reasons. But I think that the main thing should be that you do comparative so that you make sure that your team always wins. If that sometimes means you need to destroy the argument of the other side, that means you use rebuttal, but you have to make sure you win the comparatives, because if you do rebuttal without the comparatives, I don't think you can win the debate. If you do the comparatives without the rebuttal, sometimes you can win the debate. So I think rebuttal should be a means to the end of winning the comparative. Okay, so again, two questions which are kind of similar. So how do you go about tracking the debate in your notes? And are there any good note-taking strategies for whip speakers? So I usually, in first half, I write my whip speeches and I track the debate in a way very similar to judging. Of course, not the exact same way, because I care less about the details and the mechanisms, because very often your rebuttal is not going to like go into every single logical step. Sometimes it will, right? But I think I care most about things where I'm like, oh, I need to rebut that in order to make it comparative, but I track it very similarly. So I kind of fold my paper into, I write down everything that they're saying, and I try to see what the most important parts are. And then if I usually have a marker somewhere, and I mark stuff that I find the most important, and that I definitely want to get into during my speech. And then during extension speakers, I take out 2, 3, 4 papers, write down clashes, start fitting everything in that I want to say. During my own extension speaker, I kind of make sure that I have the time to write down what they say and fit that into the rest of the debate. Depending in CG, I just do the same thing as I would for a DLO. And during basically just listening to it, if it fits really nicely within a clash, I'll put it within a clash. Very often I'm like, well, extraneous point of rebuttal, I'll just deal with it extraneously. If I'm CO, I'll put it all in kind of, I'll put the extension of government in the same way. I'll put opening government's case, so I'll fit it into clashes or trade-offs or rebuttal. And if necessary, I'll make like a separate clash for what they say if it's really different. And then I start kind of fitting everything into clashes whilst listening. I will say that I'm a very experienced whip speaker, so I don't need that much time to start putting everything into clashes. I can imagine if it's not as easy, or if you're still getting used to the clash structure, is during, like, when I just started debating, very often I would identify clashes a lot earlier, and I would start writing into clashes immediately, which basically means kind of having to scratch it out sometimes and your notes being a lot messier, but it does mean that you have more time to listen. Okay, so a question on drills I recommend for teaching beginners in whip speeches. So as I said, if you really want to help people develop it as whips, I think it helps to judge debates and discuss debates with them, especially because I think you have to get some sort of intuition. You don't have to be a good judge to give good whip speeches. I was a very bad judge when I was giving already quite okay whip speeches. But you do have to get some sort of an intuition. So I think that judging works really well. I think second, we tend to focus on the small things when we're teaching people how to do whips. So we are like, oh, that one part of the rebuttal wasn't very good. This wasn't very good. So make sure you still step back and have like an overview and think, look, all of these different things were happening, but did you make sure that your extension was flashed out and that people knew what was new and why it was important? Did you explain the comparatives and why your team was best? How did you do those things? So I think that is something that you need to be, you need to focus on. And just time management. If you really wanted people to do whips, make them do 5-minute whips on 7-minute debates, because that forces you to make decisions. And I think that the one thing you need to develop as a whip speaker is being confident in making decisions. I make the wrong decisions every once in a while. It sucks, but you have to make some decision. And I think short speeches also force people to do that. More questions. So it seems hard to think about the clashes and listen carefully to your opponents. Yes. So I think the first thing is, if you have already thought about the clashes, so what I said, like, does it work? What's the collateral? And is it worth it? If those are things that you're thinking about, if that's kind of the structure you have in your head, I think it's very likely that you don't have to do that much organization and have to kind of restructure your entire speech, which gives you a little bit of space. I think the second thing on how do you focus on your own speech or your teammate's speech, this is my personal strong belief. If you're a second speaker, whether that's first half or second half, perhaps not important for you, and you basically just have to support your first speaker and listen. And I realize that is a lot more difficult if you're a second speaker in first half, but also during whips. Like, I think realistically seen, there's still going to be so much that you have to add in. And I think that you have to still listen to the debate so much that you can't really prep anyway. So it's going to be quite useless prep besides identifying clashes and kind of thinking about how you think the debate's going to go. I think focusing on your teammate's speech is most important. And I think the second thing is the second thing is, if your teammate's speech is going to be really good, you're probably also going to talk through the way the debate's going to go. If you're in second half, right, you're still going to talk about what's first half going to say, what are we going to add. So usually that discussion will already feed into your own prep. Then there's a question on listening to the opposing team speeches and writing down what they're saying versus kind of thinking of rebuttal. I think, so there's two ways of listening to a speech, for me at least. So I think that there's one way when you're a judge and you're writing everything down and you want to make sure you get all the mechanisms and all the steps. I think if you're listening to it because you have to rebut it, you kind of focus on the headlines a little bit. So if someone has 5 mechanisms, very unlikely you're going to rebut all of those 5 mechanisms. Probably you're going to focus a little bit more abstractly. You're either going to talk about their assumptions. You're going to say, look, those might be true, but there's this big other thing that's also happening. Like, you're not going to talk about all 5. So do not get distracted by the itty gritty groundwork if you're doing a whip, right? I think one, that's the responsibility of your extension speaker. They have to make sure the mechanisms are being thought out. But I think 2, kind of, you want to have the headlines of arguments and then rebut those. And this is not to say that details don't matter, but I think if you have an idea about, like, if this house would ban drugs, I'm just going to go back to that argument, but, and someone says, well, there's something with the black market and people are going to be criminals. I think you can predict where the argument is going. So instead of listening to every word they're saying, just kind of write that down, say there's a black market, think of the response to that. And then kind of go listen to the speech thinking, is there something that's being said that my response doesn't tackle, rather than trying to write everything down and then think of a response. Just switch that around, think, oh, they're going to talk about the black market. Okay, so I think I'm going to say this about that, and then listen to their speech and think, this is a detail that I should rebut separately, or this is something that deals with my response. But very often your response will be enough that you don't have to write down every single word they have. And I think the last thing is, very often people get critique on poor listening and note-taking skills. But usually, and I'm not sure that's the case for you, but I think usually you know the argument that you're trying to rebut. You're afraid you're not going to be able to rebut that argument, so therefore you misrepresent the argument a little bit to make it easier to rebut. And then people say, well, you didn't really represent the argument very well. I don't think you understood the argument. So I think that it again comes down to also just taking the risk and trying to rebut the best possible argument. And then it will be easier and you don't have to listen that much. And I think the speech I listen to most is my own extension speaker if I'm doing whip speeches. That's the moment where I'm truly, truly paying attention. Like, I pay attention to everything, of course, but like, that's the moment where I'm sitting there kind of not thinking that much, pen in hand, writing stuff down, and focusing on that most. So I think, yeah, that I think is also important, because that's someone you can build on. They probably have thought about mechanisms. And I know it's not as easy to say it's someone's responsibility. Everything's a team thing. Whip speakers are responsible for supporting their extension speaker. Everything extension speaker missed, you're responsible for filling in. But if there's particular mechanisms that you need very precise responses to, I think very often that should be an extension speech, because those extension speeches kind of have to do the ground battle of mechanistic logic. And us whip speakers can kind of step back and be like, well, they thought about the mechanisms, I'm going to talk about something else. Okay, so then someone asks, what is a good way to outweigh your top half if your analysis hits much of the same impacts, or is in part reliant on their contribution? Good question. I'd like to know that. No kidding. I think that so as I said, trading off between clashes, even if you hit on the same impacts or hint at the same things, very often you have a slightly different focus or a slightly different outcome. You can still weigh those impacts. Even if they're very similar, you can still weigh them. So even if you both talk about drug addicts and what's going to happen to them if you ban drugs or legalize drugs, I guess in the majority of countries, some people are going to talk about criminal contact. Some people are going to talk about the quality of drugs. So just be super precise in what your impacts are, and very often there will be a difference and you can still trade those off. And I think too, this is where it becomes important, and this is where I would say you have to judge the debate. So you have to say, this is what they're saying. These are the particular parts that are missing in their speeches. So they didn't explain A, B, C. We fill in those gaps. The reason those gaps need to be filled in order to win the debate is whatever. So I think you have to explain why what you're adding is so important in the debate and why the argument cannot stand otherwise. So if the debate is about quotas and everyone's talking about, and both you and first half are talking about role models, and it's like good to have a role model, and you're the team that fills in why specifically young people are going to need role models, or why specifically role models within a company are important, or what they can do for policy. I have no idea, but very like only a small argument of the role model part. You have to explain why the entire argument is reliant on that, or why it becomes a lot more important if you explain that one particular part within the debate. And I think that is important. I think thirdly, and I don't have statistical proof for this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is that if there's one side wins, so like an op sweep or a prop sweep, very often second half becomes first and first half becomes second. So basically opening opposition is so far the best team, closing opposition beats that team, but then closing opposition becomes first, opening opposition becomes second. So I think that don't focus too much on, and if that doesn't happen, then all of a sudden closing opposition didn't really have an extension, and then they take a third behind opening government, right? I think don't focus too much on always becoming first if you're not that certain that your extension is new or that your extension adds everything, and just make sure that you at least rebut the other side. So worst case scenario, you take a second to your opening. Whereas if you only focusing on trying to prove what's new and only focusing on trying to compare yourself against opening, if you then lose that comparative, that can be kind of a all or nothing strategy, because if you lose that comparative, it becomes a lot more difficult to win from the other sides if you don't spend that much time on it. So I think judging the debate, explaining what the judges are going to have to think about, and then at the same time, don't over focus. If you're losing that, just don't spend too much time on it. And I think I usually just focus on impact. First halves are very bad at impacts very often. So if you're like, well, we're the first one to actually explain why this matters, I think that usually helps a lot as well. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to, I think I've touched upon a lot of things already, but I think the last thing that I wanted to talk was new stuff in WIPs, because that's something that I always would get critiqued on when I was starting. So I think that there's three things that you can do. So you can add new rebuttal, new analysis, and new trade-offs, but new arguments you shouldn't. And this is not because judges won't credit you, because pro tip, I've heard well, it was kind of new, but I credited you, but other judges might not have credited you so often. I think very often judges do credit unless it's like completely crazy, new, we've never heard this before and it's completely new, but it's kind of on the same topic. I think very often judges credit you, but I think it does a discredit to your extension speech. So I think that your job as a WIP speaker is to flash out what's good in your extension speech. And I think WIP speakers, especially newer WIP speakers, you're very happy that you're at the end of the debate, you've come up with something, you have a very smart idea, and good for you. Honestly, it's great, but don't get carried away by that. And I don't think that a smart idea, even if it's smart, the fact that you're the first one to talk about it, your extension speech didn't really talk about it, means you cannot build on anything. So it needs to be a very, very, very good idea to outweigh the fact that your extension speaker didn't talk about it that much. So I think that I would definitely just, from a strategic standpoint, doing too much new stuff in your whip is just not useful because you're spreading yourself too thin as a team, which means you don't have a clear argument that judges can credit. Other teams have explained their arguments for 14 minutes. You've explained your arguments for 7 and 7 minutes, which is basically very often means it's spread too thin. It's not explained well enough to carry as much weight. So even if your extension speaker brings an argument which you don't think is the strongest in the debate, or brings a trade-off which you don't think is the strongest, the fact that it already has 7 minutes of analysis means it's easier to win than coming up with a completely new thing. Someone asks, if your opening half did strong enough rebuttals, do you rebut again? How can you rebut without being repetitive? I think if an argument is dead, it's dead, right? You cannot kill it further. You cannot rebut it further. It's very useless to continue focusing on that. So I think you just have to judge. I mean, whip speakers are biased judges, right? But you just have to think of, one, is it still necessary for me to win the comparative to do this rebuttal? And two, does the argument still stand? Is there a risk at the end where someone says, oh, well, closing opposition didn't respond to that, and even though opening opposition has defeated the argument and the argument doesn't really stand, closing opposition did nothing to the argument, so therefore opening government wins over opening or closing opposition. I think if that's the case, you still have to rebut it. If it's dead in the water and there's an argument that opening government made and no one talks about it, it's completely rebutted, CG doesn't rebuild it, it just doesn't stand anymore, OO did like minutes of making fun of it and rebutting it, just let it kind of like ignore it. And you can quickly respond, like even if you're worried, you can kind of repeat it. But I think that if the rebuttal is really that good that the argument doesn't stand anymore, I don't think you have to spend any time on that at all. So yeah, I think those are the main things that I think whip speakers have to do. As I said, you have to be supportive of your extension speech. That's your main job. You have to flash them out. You have to be like, look at how amazing these people are, or this person was. And I think too, you have to do what's necessary. So you cannot think too much in the beginning, like I'm going to only do rebuttal, but I think your goal is to win comparatives, and you win them, and you have to win them in whichever way you're able to do so. And yeah, if there's any questions that people want to ask right now, feel free to. Someone is asking on how to prioritize material, but what type of prioritization do you mean exactly? Okay, no clarification. So prioritizing material, I think the way you should prioritize material is there's different types of material, right? There is the things you're clearly winning, the things that are still up in the air, and the things you're clearly losing. I think you can decide on how to structure those and how to spend your time on those, depending on the type of speech that you're going to give. So I think if you're going to focus a lot on winning all of the clashes, going head to head on the mechanisms, kind of being like, look, there's just one thing that is important in this entire debate. Everyone wants less drug addicts. Everyone wants more women in power in the quota debate. This isn't about anything else, just about what's happening here. I think in those instances when you're all talking about the same thing, I would focus mostly on the strongest argument of the other side. And I would focus on the things that we're currently losing while still pointing out we're winning, but I would mostly focus on what are we losing? How can I make sure the damage done on those parts of the argument isn't as bad? And then still make a comparative and say, well, the stuff we're winning is obviously more important, but I would focus mostly on kind of reducing the damage and saying this isn't something this isn't as true as they say. This is the reason why this only happens in the minority of cases. This is why this doesn't work. So I would strongly focus on what you're currently losing. If it is a debate where you're going to make a trade-off and there's one clash that you're losing, but there's another clash you're bringing to the debate that you're going to explain that is more important, I would focus mostly on your own material, and I would just kind of give credit where credit is due and say, look, even if what they say is true, doesn't really matter, and kind of not spend too much time on their very strong mechanisms, simply because you have another way of pushing them out of the debate, right? You can either rebut them and push them out of the debate, or frame them away and say they're not important and get them out of the debate. And you're choosing the second one, which means I wouldn't spend too much time also trying to rebut them, because it's not as important. And when it comes to, in general, prioritizing, go for the strongest team, go for the strongest material, go for the strongest mechanisms, or for the strongest impacts. If you're trying to frame away the argument, if you're trying to rebut an argument and you rebut the weakest link, people are just not going to be impressed. Even the rebuttal that you did is going to be less useful, because whilst writing it down, you're still going to think, yeah, but I mean, that's not what they really said, or that's not what they tried to say, or that's not the main point of their argument. So if you really go for rebuttal, pick the strongest one first and take that one down. And then once that's down, it's easier to take down the rest. And often, like, teams have spent so much time on the strongest one that once you get that out of the way, there's just not that much left. And I think it also shows that you're not scared of dealing with the argument. So if you kind of tiptoe around it and don't deal with the strongest argument when you're trying to rebut it, I think, I think that that's just an issue where people, I as a judge, like, if I'm judging, I'm not dumb, right? I know an argument is strong. If you then do rebuttal and you don't do the strongest, I'm gonna assume that you don't know how to deal with it. And I think that if you do go for the strongest, that just works better. Even if you don't succeed completely, I think it at least shows you understood the way the debate goes. Someone asks, if you provide additional mechanisms on something your opening has done and then provide new impacts, the credit usually still goes to your opening. How do you prevent this from happening? Okay, so I think one thing is style and being explicit. And I know that's really difficult in the beginning, but you have to be confident and say, look, these are the three things that our opening has done. I'm giving them full credit, maybe even give them a little bit too much credit. The judges think, did they really do that? And just say, look, these are the three things that they've done. What we have done is we've provided these extra mechanisms, making the impact a lot better. We have provided this new impact. We've talked about this new group in the way this kind of, we've broadened the debate. There's a lot more people we talk about, or if they're more important, or any of the other things that I talked about of how to trade off the impact. And be extremely explicit about that, and kind of just stand there and say, this is what they've said, this is what we've said. I think the worst thing you can do is not say anything about it. I think the second worst thing you can do is talk about your opening, but then not crediting them, giving the idea that you are doing something very similar. So the bigger the risk of sounding similar to your opening, the more you should focus on being very nice to them and crediting them enough, and making sure you say, look, these are the arguments that they did actually bring. And because then, one, for yourself, it becomes easier to kind of pinpoint where you are adding things, because you can just be super concrete about it. You can say, this is the one mechanism we add, this is why it's so important. And I think, too, just judging wise, if you give them credit, and I as a judge know that you know what they said, and you're still explaining what is new, I think it makes it less likely that judges overlook it. Whereas if you misrepresent them, or don't talk about them, or don't kind of acknowledge the fact that you're doing something similar, judges think, have they not listened to first half? Did they think of this extension before the debate started? Have they not adapted at all? Whereas if you kind of give them credit, I think that's less likely to happen. And I think very often you'll then get the credit. And just making the explicit comparison, as I said, I think works really well in judging why particular parts of your speech are so important. Someone asks, if you're second speaker of an opening half, do you need to do the comparative and say where your team wins over the opening counterpart? So kind of like, how much does DPM or DLO look like a whip? Look, so I'm a lazy mechanistic speaker. I like comparatives because it means you don't have to do the very specific individual links. So I would say yes, they're a very nice way. I don't think you have to. I think there's different ways of doing DPMs and DLOs, which are still super valid. You can do loads of constructive or deconstructive and everything is fine. I think especially in DLO, it is good to kind of think of the broader debate already and place yourself in it. DPM is just difficult because you've only had one speech you can really compare yourself against. Like it's difficult, and I think you should still set up the comparative and you should explain the impact, and you should try, like, you minimize the risk of someone you should minimize the risk of someone doing what I've talked about, so kind of trading yourself off and already talking about impact and how many people it affects. And especially in DLO, as I said, I would do a short comparative, but it's not as easy, and there's not as many teams, and it's not as necessary very often. So it's a strategy. I'm not sure if it's the strategy, whereas I think in whip speeches you have to do comparatives. I know there's going to be people who disagree, but I think you have to do comparatives in order to do good whip speeches in 90% of the cases. How do you answer a POI that would push you to speak about implicit burdens instead of the mainstream that the debate is following? So POIs, I think, asked to whip speakers are often very bad because people think, I have this new great idea that I'm going to introduce in the debate. I'm in first half, I don't have time to respond to this, so I'm going to push the entire rebuttal to an extension into a 10-second POI. I think often if something like that happens and you get a completely new POI in your whip and you're like, what is this person even talking about? No one has talked about this before. You just say that and people will listen to it, right? You're like, look, that sounds like a really good case. Shame you didn't bring it. I think if it is about burdens and all of a sudden you get POIs on like specific implicit burdens, I would just say, look, I've already dealt with that. Like I've talked about this particular clash, which already answers the implicit question that you're asking. So just identify it and flash it. But I think very often POIs in whip speeches aren't as good, or at least I'm more worried about taking a POI in first half than second half, because I think in second half very often people just try to do too much in the POI and you just point that out and you're like, look, 15 seconds is not enough to make an argument, which works rather well. And if not, I think very often you just point towards the clash, which you're going to do or did to answer it and say, I've done that. If it is about burdens or implicit stuff. I think in general in a whip, you can have a little bit more debate strategy. So if someone tries to push a burden on you, which is unfair in a POI, you can just be like, look, this is a burden which is unfair and I don't want to do this. And this is not something that I should have to defend. So I think that's the way you can do that. Are there any other questions? Cool. Then I think this training session ends. If you have any other questions on whip speeches, feel free to message me on Discord or whatever. And I hope you all come to the amazing training sessions that we're still going to have. And thanks very much for participating, and I hope it was useful. I'm not sure if I can stop the recording, but